Frank Botta is the immediate past president of the Transportation Lawyers Association. Frank, tell us what this group does.
Well, the Transportation Lawyers Association just celebrated its 80th anniversary, and we comprise with the largest group of transportation attorneys throughout the United States who cover all modes of transportation, both motor carrier, rail, air, and maritime.
So what are some of the specific challenges that the association helps truckers with on a regular basis?
Well, our members represent multiple number of truck lines, from the regional, national, and local carriers in all different aspects, be it contractual, employment related, anything which relates to trucking as casualty cases or accident cases. We cover all the gambits related to motor carrier trucks.
And what were some of your responsibilities as president? How long a term did you have?
That was a one-year term, and all of our officers go through a 4-year ladder to reach the top of the stage and oversee the associations and its goodwills moving forward for hopefully another 80 years.
Frank, we're trying to build on a basic foundation here, and we want to learn more about trucking first in general, and just how much do we rely on trucks to move goods across the state of Pennsylvania?
Well, not only in the state of Pennsylvania, but throughout the country. Trucks touch almost every aspect of the goods that we consume or we use, and it's a vital aspect of our vitality, of our continued lifestyle, and I think about 80% of the goods that we touch are moved by motor carriers.
And just how important is the Pennsylvania Turnpike to truckers?
Well, the Pennsylvania Turnpike was the first turnpike went through and was in existence to get us quicker, faster, and a more convenient way to travel.
And that was some 50, 60 years ago, I think.
Exactly.
And as far as data, is there data that exists that tells us how much the truckers rely on the Turnpike? And they have some other options, obviously, to get across the state, too, toll-free options.
Yeah, many toll-free options, but usually the toll roads are the most convenient and the fastest way to get from point A to point B.
And let's talk about the expenses in general that a trucker has to deal with that everyday Pennsylvanians who are driving their cars across the state might not think about.
Well, you know, a lot of the trucks that we see on the roads are independent operators. And so those independent operators have to incur all the expenses associated with running the business, be it from the cost of the rig, the expenses of operating the rig, the maintenance of the rig, the fuel to put into the rig to get from point A to point B, taxes associated, both state and federal taxes, as running its small business and its own operation. The truck driver in those instances have to cover those expenses if it's not a company vehicle.
And just how common are trucking companies as opposed to independent truckers? I'm trying to get just a basic idea of about how many independent truckers are out there in contrast to company truckers.
I would say that there's more than likely, from what I understand, there's an organization called ORITA. They have over 600,000 members that are part of that independent owner-operator arrangement in that association. So there's a vast amount of independent owner-operators, and because of the costs associated with running a company, they rely on mostly pushing those costs to owner-operators.
Let's talk about an expense that most Pennsylvania motorists can relate to, and that's providing fuel for the rig. Now, these guys driving trucks are not buying gasoline, they're getting diesel fuel. How does a gallon of diesel fuel compare to a gallon of gas?
Well, if you look at the gauge, whatever you're filling up your tank, you'll see the difference. It's a lot higher than your regular gas that you put in your automobile.
And gas is about $3 a gallon now.
Correct. And I would say that, you know, depending on where you are and what state you're in, you're paying at least 50 cents more.
Another 50 cents per gallon.
Yes.
And then you have a massive fuel tank. I wonder how many gallons per mile you get, just roughly, if you have a big load on hold.
It depends on the weight of the load. but it's not as economy effective as we have in our own automobiles. It's much more expensive.
Talk some more about other expenses involved in driving a trailer truck. You mentioned taxes before, and what are the other costs of driving a trailer truck that our viewers might not think about?
Well, we talked about the fuel. We talked about the taxes associated with that, the maintenance of the vehicle.
Did those
itself.
taxes change much from year to year? Like, for instance, there were some federal tax changes recently, and were truckers recently affected by those changes?
Well, truckers in company-owned vehicles, the deductions that they take were impacted to an extent. And so that and the cost to those individual owner-operators continue to escalate, just like everything else that we incur. The fuel itself is increasing, paying for the maintenance of the vehicle, paying for parts. They're not going down, they're going up.
Mm-hmm. And it's in most cases, it's in effect a one-person company, isn't it?
More times than not it is, but some owner-operators have multiple employees that they have to run their operations.
So let's talk about the tolls on the Turnpike, and that's the main reason we have you here today. It costs less than about $50 to drive a car from coast to coast here in Pennsylvania. How much does a 6-axle trailer truck have to pay for the same ride?
Well over $100.
And were there any recent increases to the Turnpike tolls?
Well, every year, unfortunately, Pennsylvania has faced increases it never has faced in its past, starting as recent as 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And before that, I think between 1957 and 2008, there was only 5 increases that came into play for the Pennsylvania Turnpike and the tolls being increased during that time period.
So then the toll increases came suddenly, I think it's fair to say, back in 2008. And what precipitated that? What were the conditions back then?
Well, there was an enactment called Act 44 that was enacted in 2007, which impacted the way in which the state was going to handle the tolls in Pennsylvania. And in 2008, the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission entered into a public-to-public partnership with PennDOT. Mm-hmm. And it agreed to share its expenses, the revenue that it received through the turnpikes with PennDOT. And so that has created a lot of issues that we know are part of a recent lawsuit.
So before 2008, the Turnpike toll rate schedule was really left alone for a long time, wasn't it? Why is that?
It was the purpose of the tolls were for user fees. And you paid a toll, and the Pennsylvania Turnpike used those fees in order to upkeep the roads, repairs, the services that it needed in order to be a low-key provider for those people that traveled the Turnpike. Mm-hmm. And the usage fees were much less than what we're facing today because there's a lot of the revenue that's being diverted for PennDOT's purposes.
Now, the main reason we have you here today, Frank, is to explain to us this case involving the truckers suing the Turnpike. So who exactly is the injured party here, and what do they want?
Well, the injured party or the plaintiffs are 2 named associations, the Independent Owner-Operators and the Motor Association, along with named individual independent contractors that have stake in this case. And they filed a case recently against against Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission and all of its officers and officials that are part of the state, requiring that the user fees only be used for Turnpike purposes rather than being diverted and the revenue being given to PennDOT, which has been quite substantial.
So is this easy for the truckers to show that, in fact, the fees have not been used exclusively to maintain the Turnpike?
It's easy for them to show because the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission has statistics. It has earmarked certain revenues to go to PennDOT for specific purposes which are not transportation related. And it's easy for them to show that these fees and the revenues from the Turnpike are not being used for the intended purposes, for strictly Turnpike purposes, and being diverted for a lot of other state-required earmarked sources, such as parks,
Oh, not even transportation
Not
related?
even-
Is that so?
not even transportation. You know, you'll be surprised whenever you see what the revenue, and it's. I think that last year, the total amount of revenue was diverted to PennDOT was like close to $500,000, and those funds were being used for parks, being used for the fixing of a roof, for transit authority, but those.
And this $500,000 or $500 million payment,
$500 million, I'm sorry.
$500 million payment is a regular thing that the Turnpike pays to PennDOT, right?
It's on an annual basis, and it's being paid according to the Act 44, which was amended in 2008, Act 89.
So the truckers, in effect, want their money back because they're saying that the toll revenue is not being used for its intended purpose, which is maintaining the turnpike exclusively, right?
There's constitutional claims that they have. They have, it's a violation of interstate commerce, and also a violation of the Privilege and Immunity Clause of the Constitution, which allows a person to transgress or to move through interstate commerce. And so the constitutional claims are twofold, but the monies that are being requested are not reaching back. It's moving forward. They're not asking to be refunded. They're asking to be they're asking for the intended purpose of the tolls to be used for its intended purpose.
Well, how did they arrive at that $6 billion figure, which even in the world of government is not a small sum?
Well, so far, I believe that the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission has paid roughly $4.9 billion to PennDOT. And over the course, I think it goes through 2023, those costs, or 2057, I'm sorry, will exceed $9 billion. And so they're trying to stop it. They're trying to stop the bleeding. They're asking for the courts to intercede to make certain that the funds that the toll user pays are being used for the intended purposes, for those user fees that when they go to the gates, that the average truck driver believes that those funds are being used for the highways that they transgress.
Well, just how clear is state law about how these funds should be spent?
Well, Act 44 and 89 spell out, and it's sort of a way in which the state was able to generate funds for fixing bridges, fixing roads, fixing parks, fixing lights on certain city streets. It was a way in which our legislature was able to finagle a way in which they were able to reach for funds and revenues for other purposes.
So the legislature, have they made a regular request of the Turnpike Commission to turn over that $500 million for projects not related to the Turnpike?
They've made a request. First, they tried to, and they filed for a preliminary injunction, which was an emergency order by the court to stop the bleeding, to have the court address it. And recently, just a few weeks ago, I think the plaintiffs withdrew that preliminary injunction, and they decided not, for whatever strategic reason, not to pursue it in that respect, but to have the case go through its regular course. And the parties, I believe, agreed recently to file summary disposition papers to have the court address it through written pleadings.
Okay, well, now we have a pretty good understanding what the case is about, Frank, so why not give us your personal take on this case with the disclaimer that you're not involved with this case, are you?
I'm not, and I'm just looking from it from the outside as the public is. But with my legal background, I could see that this case is likely to go to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in Pennsylvania. I think that's where it's headed. I think that the way in which they removed themselves, the plaintiffs removed themselves from the preliminary injunction request that they initially had, they want to get it to that Third Circuit Court of Appeals quickly, rather than having a local or a federal court address the issue without a chance to fully digest the legal issues and to have it brought to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, where I think it's going to end up.
Well, let me put it this way, Frank. What is the central issue or issues of this case, or the central question, if you want to put it that way, that the court has to address?
Well, I think that whether or not the revenues from the Turnpike Commissions are being used for its intended purposes. The user fees are paid for specific reasons, and whether or not the legislative act of Act 44 and 89 are constitutional to allow the state to divert funds other than its reasonable expected use.
Now, in your opinion, just how big a deal is this for government? Because, again, $6 billion is a large sum, and let's say the state were to lose this case. What would the immediate consequences be?
Well, I think that there's been quotes in the paper that the legislator feels as though that would cripple its budget and therefore has great consequences. This case, I think, is one which we all have to watch because most of us travel the Turnpike, and we want to make certain that those funds are being used in a way in which we expect them to be used for the purposes of repairs, maintenance, and keeping the highway easily accessible for a fee which is reasonable.
Now, while I was researching for this interview, I saw the phrase immediate irreparable harm. What is that, and what does that mean in this case?
Well, that's what I talked about. They requested additionally a preliminary